I'm just going to leave it on.
Hey, good morning, guys and ladies. I'm Veronica Salazar, Deacon Gus's wife. I just wanted to invite you all to, I don't know if you're aware of the Bible in a Year program from Ascension Press with Father Mike Schmitz. How many of you have read the Bible through, cover to cover? No, I have read it just in the lectionary 3-year cycle. No, you just read like 60% of the Bible. Who went through the first 8 chapters of First Chronicles? Yeah, okay. Yeah, you're brave. But anyhow, guys, I have some flyers in here in English and Spanish, Español, that you can scan the code and go to the podcast. I have to tell you, I did the program last year. It was life transforming. I mean, you are going to make so many connections, especially you guys are going to be preaching in here when you read about the sacrifice in Leviticus, and you can make the bridge to what it is, the sacrifice of Christ, and why the sacrifice of Christ is the one and only that supersedes every other sacrifice of the Old Testament. It's amazing. So I have some flyers if you're interested, and I really think you should do it. You can scan it, listen to the podcast, read your Bible, read along or whatever. Just see me, okay? Thank you.
What is the code? Is there a code you said?
Yeah, I have the QR code. You just take a camera on your phone, and it's going to take you to the Ascension Press website.
Or ask your children or grandchildren.
Go to ascension.com. You can also get it on Spotify, all of them. Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Yes,
Okay, so I just got a hold of Father Matlack, and has COVID. So we're going to set up a Zoom. I don't know, and I'll have to send out to all the people who are watching on live stream. I have to send the Zoom link, but I'll move the screen out here closer for us to be able to see, and then we'll have to do it remotely real quick. Okay, so how about taking a 5-minute break until I get everything set up, and then come back in and we'll reassemble.
Yeah, there's one there too. You just said it's not long enough. Worst comes to worst, John, here you go. Worst comes to worst, we get the TV. Let me check. John. Hey, John. John, you saw. And then you, John, on this side. Enjoy it.
Okay, Father Matlock sent me the Zoom link. We'll get started here in just a minute. All right, everybody. Let's take our seats. Father Matlock is on the Zoom and ready to start presenting.
This Deacon Sam. Yes.
All right, we've run into another little snag, and that is that we can't hear Father Matlock, although he can hear all of us, and everybody else can hear each other. So John Leininger has agreed to spin up a Zoom. I'll send out a new Zoom link to everyone who's online, which there's a lot of people online, and then we'll get started, and hopefully everything will work this time.
Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me now? Okay, thank you very much for doing this. Okay. Thank you very much. I have a question more. Since I have a little slideshow, is will people be able to see it? Okay. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. And do you think the screen would be big enough for people to see?
Yes.
Okay. And people would be able to hear me okay without stuff?
Yeah, good. Everybody's raising their hand, they can hear you fine.
Oh, how nice, thank you. Okay, let me maximize the screen then. I'll do this. Yeah.
So those of you who are here,
Now, if I do that, can you see the full screen or just,
No, you want to go up to the top?
is it a little screen or is it a full screen?
No, not full screen. You have to go up to the top and say that you just want it.
okay, so
Up here?
if you have questions for him, just
Okay.
come up.
How's that? Okay. Okay. Yes, sir.
I think you are pretty much taking care of it. Maybe a few more people trying to get you
Okay, and I presume you already done your prayers?
Yes, we did. Yes, we did. Yes, we did.
Okay, if it's okay, I'm just going to mute everybody, or Deacon John, could you mute everyone for me?
Yes, everybody's muted. No, I'm not. You will not.
Okay,
And we're leaving this computer open, so if somebody has a question, you can talk.
great. Would you mind perhaps muting yourself just for my talking part and then unmute yourself at the end?
I have to leave it to say everything.
Oh, very well. Okay, wonderful. Well, good morning, everyone at Transfiguration Church in Blythburgh, as well as deacons from around the Charleston Diocese world. I'm very sorry that I couldn't be, even though we are, of course, an hour late, but this is what happens with technology. I'm very sorry that I couldn't be there with you in person. I had intended, in fact, to attend the Vespers and the ordination of your new bishop, and then I woke up very early on Thursday morning, preparing to go to Charleston. I woke up with a fever, I think it was 102 or something, and I felt like death, and did a rapid COVID test and tested positive. So I thought it might not be a good idea for me to potentially infect the whole of the Diocese of Charleston and all of the deacons with my virus. So I was unable to attend the ordination, but I do hope and pray that it went well. Perhaps for the next bishop, if I manage to live that long, of course. But anyway, and for that reason, I couldn't be down there. So I'm just recovering. I was not hospitalized next week because even though I had asthma, just more like an annoying thing, lots of aches and pains. I slept for most of the day on Thursday and Friday, so perhaps I needed it. Well, in any case, Deacon John had asked me to speak to you a little bit about who we are as the Eastern Churches. Originally, my deacon was going to come down and do an individual presentation on the role of the deacons in that, but he was unable to make it, so I'm going to take his part as well today. And by the way, so since I'm coughing a little bit, so I do apologize if I speak slowly or if I'm coughing a little bit. I will do my very best to keep this as engaging a presentation as possible. So thank you so much for your understanding. Down in the Diocese of Charleston, we Eastern Catholics are few and far between. To my knowledge, the only congregation that existed within the last maybe decade or so, I could be wrong, was Saint Rafka in Rio, so just outside of Greenville. And then perhaps I think another in the Conway, if I'm not mistaken. And then, of course, when I came, I established a mission in Colombia. It was a very different situation from the certain dioceses of North, like when I used to live in Pittsburgh, or in Cleveland, Ohio, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, where our tradition is far more established. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is that the people who brought this form of the Catholic faith, originally, those original immigrants that brought this tradition with them, settled in those regions of the country where they could find work. So they went to the coal mines, the steel mills of eastern, western Pennsylvania, Ohio, and so on. Some of you might have actually been born and grew up in those areas and might know this tradition. Others of you might not be aware of this tradition at all. And so it's very, very important for people to learn about it for various reasons. I'll give you firstly the theological reason. And the best quote that I'm aware of is by Saint John Paul II. I'm sure everyone knows who he is. He was the Pope of my childhood. And in 1995, he wrote a letter called Orientale Lumen, which is translated as the Light of the East. And in that letter was he says the following in that letter, in one of the introductory paragraphs. He says, "Since in fact we believe that the venerable and ancient tradition of the Eastern churches is an integral part of the heritage of Christ's church, the first need for Catholics is to be familiar with that tradition so as to be nourished by it and to encourage the process of unity in the best way possible for each." So what's he saying in that letter? He says that the traditions of the Eastern churches are ancient and venerable. Okay, obviously, and we'll see what that means. But it's something old, and something worthy of respect. But he also says something further. He says it's an integral part of Christ's church. So in a sense, he's saying that you cannot have the heritage of the church in its fullness without recognizing these traditions. And so once that happens, he says the first need for Catholics, and of course he speaks here of all Catholics, is to be familiar with that tradition. So to get to know it, to become comfortable with it, and then look at this word, to be nourished by it. So it has something that can nourish everybody, and finally, to encourage the process of unity. And of course he's speaking here with an ecumenical heart, because as you know, perhaps you would know, one of the great priorities of his pontificate was a reunification between the Orthodox East and the Latin West, the Roman Catholic West. So this is Pope John Paul II, and it's a lovely quote that I wanted to share with you. So the best way for me to explain to you who we are as Eastern Catholics, I think I have to give you a history lesson. I call this my lightning speed history lesson or whatever of the ancient churches of the East. Well, I think we have to go back to Matthew 28:19. This, the Great Commission, where Christ says to the apostles, "Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." This is my favorite gospel passage. Pardon me. It's my favorite gospel passage because it speaks about how all the nations will somehow be called to receive this great gift. And who is going to give it to them? The gospel. It's going to be the apostles. So the apostles are dispersed throughout the known world. The most famous for Roman Catholics is people know of Saint Peter, who went to Rome via Antioch. So he becomes the apostle to Rome, if you will, founds the church there. And of course, yes, at Pentecost, the apostles are given the gift of various languages with which they are to go and preach the gospel. Now, St. Peter goes to Rome, but his brother, St. Andrew, whom we call in the Byzantine tradition the first called, because he was the first to receive the call. St. Andrew, by tradition, goes to Byzantium, the ancient Greek town of Byzantium, which later takes on the name Constantinople. Okay, so again, for a brief history lesson, 312, Constantine defeats his brother at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. He legalizes Christianity. He doesn't make it a state religion yet. That's the Emperor Theodosius later, but Constantine legalizes Christianity. And then in 331, decides to move the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome, or as we older Rome, or elder Rome, to this place. And he calls it Nea has various names. So Byzantium is the ancient name, the Greek name, Byzantion. Byzantium is a Latinism. But he calls it out himself, Constantinople. It also goes by the name Nea Roma, which in Greek means new Rome. So you have older Rome, elder Rome, and here you have new Rome. I think you probably, just by looking at this picture, know exactly what this city is called nowadays. It's obviously Istanbul in Turkey, but Constantinople, Nea Roma. So St. Andrew goes by tradition to this place and establishes the church. Whether or not that's historically accurate is, it's another discussion for scholars and historians. It's beside the point. But this is where he sets up the church. And to really make things simple, the language of Elder Rome is Latin, and the language of New Rome, Constantinople, comes to be Greek. So what happens is, if I ever use the phrase, Latin Christianity, I'm referring to the Christianity that traces its origins back to older Rome, to elder Rome. Here, if I refer to Greek Christianity, I'm referring to the Greek Christians that has its mother see, S-E-E, here in Constantinople. Now, some of you might be aware that this place became a mosque once Constantinople fell in 1453. Eventually it became a museum, and just a few years ago it became a mosque again. And this was a great wound to us Eastern Christians, even Eastern Catholics, even though we've not worshipped there for almost 1,000 years, because it was symbolic. I think the best way of explaining this is to say that imagine St. Peter's in Rome became, a mosque or whatever, some other religion. I mean, the symbol of a once great church that was your spiritual heart, if you will, becomes now the place of the worship of another faith. It creates a lot of cultural wounds, and there is indeed a lot of cultural wounds there. But that's that. Now, Greek Christianity. Now, what happens eventually? For the first 1,000 years or so of Christianity, there's a little bit of tension, cultural tension, linguistic tension between the Latin Christians and the Greek Christians. Remember, there's still one church. Okay? There's still one united Catholic Church. But there's always these cultural tensions, between the two sides. That's what happens when we don't speak each other's language. Misunderstandings occur, failures in charity and in understanding, and things begin to boil, and things, unpleasant things begin to happen as a result of that. Toward the end of that period, in the first 1,000 years, what's happening is that the Christianity is beginning to spread towards what we know now as sort of Central and Eastern Europe. So Moravia, the Czech Republic, which is just now, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Ukraine, Belarus, all those areas begin to be Christianized. Now what happens is that the Latin Christians are on the whole unsuccessful in evangelizing those territories. And part of the reason they become unsuccessful is because of the linguistic difference between the Latin and the various Slavic languages that people were using. So two very visionary saints, you may have heard of them, Cyril and Methodius, decide to take a different tactic. And they're brothers, and they're from Constantinople. Methodius is a bishop, and Cyril is a monk. Okay? So what they decide to do is they decide to go to Rome, and they speak to the Holy Father. Pardon me. They speak to the Holy Father, and they ask the Holy Father's permission to translate the Gospels and to translate the liturgical books of their Greek ritual tradition, not the Latin, but the Greek, and to take that and to evangelize all of those Slavic peoples. So beginning in Moravia and all the way, and all the way further east. Well, that's never been done up until this point. You only ever had 3 sacred languages that were pinned to the crucifix on which Christ was crucified: Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. So those were the only 3 languages that were to be allowed in worship. But here we have a totally new thing, and the Pope gives them the blessing. In fact, they actually celebrate the Divine Liturgy at St. Peter's in Rome, and with the blessing of the Holy Father, they go. And in fact, they invent their own language. In fact, they invent 2 scripts. The first one is Glagolithic. If any of you are of Croatian descent, the ancient Glagolithic language was invented by these remarkable saints. and was used by the Latin Christians of Croatia. But for the Eastern Rite Slavs, they invented the Cyrillic alphabet. And if you can see the icon, you can see the Cyrillic alphabet that they invented. So for example, Methodius is holding a gospel book here, and if I'm not mistaken, it's written in the beginning was the word. And Cyril, I guess after whom his name is Cyrillic, he is holding out a scroll with all of the letters of the alphabet that he's invented. And so they take the gospel and the Slavs are converted. The Slavs are converted to Christianity, to using the Greek tradition. Now, my ancestors would be coming from this. In the year 988, Kievan Rus was Christianized. This is an image here of Saint Vladimir the Great, or Volodymyr the Great. And Christianity takes root in Kievan Rus. And by the way, a lot of this is important to understand because part of what's going on with the war with Russia and with Ukraine has to do with a somewhat shared religious history. If you look at the word Kiev and Rus, you'll see here two words. You'll see Kiev and Rus. Okay, so you have the origin of the word Russia, and Kiev obviously is the capital of Ukraine. But before there was a Russia, hundreds of years before there was a Russia, there was a state known as Kievan Rus, over which ruled Vladimir and his grandmother, Princess Olga. They Christianized Kievan Rus, and I'll give you an example. They built this magnificent cathedral. Was built. I actually took this picture when I visited Ukraine back in 2010. This is a 10th century cathedral of Saint Sophia. It's a sort of a museum. I think religious services are held there from time to time, but it's a magnificent building. And the people were very saddened recently because there was apparently a threat to destroy it, but luckily I don't think that has occurred. So hundreds of years before Moscow and before the Russian country, you had Christianity taking root in this part of the world. Thanks again to the efforts of these two missionaries and the blessing of the Pope. Now, what happens now? Again, this is 10th century. About a century later, in the 11th century, what, in my opinion, one of the most tragic events in Christian history occurs. This is a little image here of Peter and Andrew. Sorry, it's a bit pixelated, but Peter and Andrew, remember, two brothers, one representing the Latin West, older Rome, the other representing the Greek East, New Rome. And the Great Schism was really, the break between the Eastern and the Western churches. And it was really a tragic shame. Studying this schism as I have for many years, you wouldn't believe the reasons for why the schism actually took place. It was, as many scholars point out, a political silliness more than anything else. You had, again, linguistic differences and cultural animosity building up over hundreds of years, and silly issues like, can priests wear beards, or must they be clean shaven? Should we be fasting on Saturday or should we not? And even more serious, the marriage and celibacy question was also there. The jurisdiction of the Pope, yes, somewhat, but perhaps even more explicit, which is seems totally nonsensical nowadays. Do we use leavened bread for the Eucharist or unleavened bread? And so on. Things of that nature eventually just boil up and explode. And the event that symbolizes the schism was Cardinal Humbert goes to Constantinople with a papal bull of excommunication. And he marches right into Hagia Sophia, which is show you the picture. This church. He marches right into this church during the celebration of the sacred liturgy. And he slaps the papal bull of excommunication on the altar. Patriarch Michael Kerularius is celebrating the divine liturgy. Well, unbeknownst to Cardinal Humbert, the Pope who had issued that bull had died during Humbert's voyage to Constantinople, which means that that bull was now null and void. But he didn't know that. Obviously, we didn't have Twitter in those days. But he did it anyway, and that caused, again, a lot of damage. And, various Eastern patriarchs basically tried to step in and say, hold on, guys, let's stop this. This is ridiculous. But again, the damage was done. And in 1054, it's a symbolic date of the schism between the East and the West. And from this point, you have this break. Now, for the next 500 years or so, various people tried to fix this schism. They tried to fix this divide. And perhaps the most important efforts were two ecumenical councils. The first one was Second Lyon in 1274. I think I got that right. And the second one, and perhaps even more important, was this one, the Council of Florence in 1439. And in this council, various Greek bishops from Constantinople journeyed to Rome, or journeyed to Florence rather, and they agreed to reunite with Rome. And remember, in these days, these four folks from Constantinople are under threat, because what's going to happen? Nearly a couple of decades later is the Ottoman Turks are going to invade. And so part of the reason why they want to reunite with Rome is, they want guns, they want ships, they want money to defend themselves. But what happens is when the bishops go back to Constantinople, the people reject the union. Remember, hundreds of years of cultural animosity, they think the Latin Christians are basically the devil, and I'm sure the Latin Christians looked at the Greeks and thought the same thing, and they didn't want union. I'm right, and you're wrong. No, I'm right, and you're wrong. So this union fails. Now, this is very, very important. At this juncture in history, the Roman Church decides, well, we're not going to be able to bring all of these people back into communion with Rome. It's just not going to work. So here's what we're going to do instead. We're going to grab as many of them as we can, and instead of trying to make them Latin Christians or Latin Catholics, we're going to entice them into union with Rome by allowing them to keep as many of the traditions as they can, as we will let them keep, if you will. And maybe that will whet their appetites a little bit. And guess what? It worked. Now, of course, I say this slightly tongue-in-cheek because my ancestors were among this number, but yes, it worked. And the first of these unions was the Union of Brest in 1596. Again, I'm sorry for the poor quality of the image. But in this union, the Metropolitan of Kiev and various bishops in what's now Ukraine and Belarus, signed a union with Rome. And in the union with Rome, various things are guaranteed. So I don't want to go through all of them, but the way of celebrating the sacraments, the feast days, the traditions, the disciplines, so that now have a group of Catholics that are praying and celebrating and feasting and fasting in a very different way than the Latin Christians of the West were doing. And so various other unions followed after this. For example, the Union of Uzhhorod. I think it's 1602, if I'm not mistaken. But this was the first one. And this was the origin of the group to which I belong, which is nowadays called the Ukrainian Greek Catholic or the Greco-Catholic Church. I say Greco-Catholic because that's a more correct terminology. Now, what does this mean? Okay. Ukrainian, it's not just an ethnic title, sort of like, Roman. It just means what the origin of that church is. Greek Catholic was a term invented by the Empress Maria Theresia. She was Habsburg, if I'm not mistaken, yes, Habsburg. In order to distinguish this type of Catholics from the Latin Catholics. So that's the proper terminology. The Latin Catholics refer to you all, and the Greek Catholics, or the Brethren Catholics, refer to me and mine. The people that followed the Greek Christianity and who, having broken communion with Rome at some point, are now in communion with Rome once again. And this is the largest of all of those bodies that are now in communion with Rome. Now, since that original union, guess how many there have been since then? There have been 22, if I'm not mistaken. The latest of which happened only a few years ago. The Holy Father, well, that was a little bit of he basically took the Ethiopians and split them into Ethiopians and Eritrean Catholics. But so you can see that this is something that's still living in the world. So this is the largest. We number about 5 million Catholics around the world. Now, I'd like you to, hopefully you can see this diagram. I want to spend just a few minutes on this because this will explain to you. Now, this might confuse you, but bear with me. Here we go. I'm going to try and summarize everything that I've just said using this diagram. Jesus is Lord, obviously, right? He starts everything. He calls his apostles and he sends his apostles throughout the world. And he says, go make Christians of everybody. What happens is the five cities that you see on the top, Rome, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, Constantinople. Those are what are called the Pentarchy. Historically, those are the 5 most important episcopal sees in the history of Christianity. Rome being the first. The second, technically, was Alexandria originally. Because why? Because that was founded by St. Mark, and St. Mark was a disciple of St. Peter. So Alexandria always held the second, followed by Antioch, which was also, by the way, founded by Peter. Eventually, remember I said Constantinople became Rome. Constantinople eventually takes the second place. So Constantinople eventually takes the second place after Rome. So you have Elder Rome, but notice this. Notice how the emperor was here, but he never ever removes the preeminence of Rome. Rome is always called the Protos, the first see. So then it goes Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch, and then Jerusalem gets added in. Sounds surprising, doesn't it, since Christ was in Jerusalem? But again, because of the apostolic precedence, that's what happens. So these are the 5 major sees. Okay? Now, from these 5 episcopal sees, look at all liturgical traditions that develop from there. Now, I want to point out an interesting figure just for your perspective. The Roman tradition, or properly speaking, the Latin tradition, and because it's more than just Rome, because there are other parts of the Latin West. The Latin tradition is numerically, in terms of the number of the faithful, the largest. Most Catholics, there's something like 98% or whatever in the world, are Latins. But it's also the minority in terms of the variety, because look at the others. So the Latin tradition is one, and there are various different usages and rites. But here you have these 5 other usages. You have the largest of which is the Byzantine. So right here on the right, more Christian churches in the world use the Byzantine rite than any other tradition in terms of variety, not in terms of the number of the faithful, in terms of variety. The Alexandrian tradition is the native African Christianity, not the Latin Christianity that has gone down there with missionaries throughout the years. I'm speaking of the ancient Egyptian and Ethiopian Christianity that predates the Latin missionaries. except North Africa. St. Augustine and Hippo, that was always a Latin colony. So we have to kind of ignore that. Okay. Then you have the West Syriac and the East Syriac. Okay, some of these are studied in India, Lebanon, and so on. And finally, the Armenian, the first nation to call itself a Christian. So just to repeat, Latins are numerically the largest, but they're the minority in terms of the ritual tradition. So what happens is, a lot of Catholics, when they hear the word Catholic, they immediately think of the Roman or the Latin Catholic expression of faith. What they don't often immediately think of is all this, the East, which are just as Catholic as the Latin. But because we're so small, especially in a diocese like Charleston or other dioceses where our presence is not so well known, it risks being forgotten. And I myself have received comments, from people. I'll give you an example. Like, what kind of priest are you? You might be a priest, but you're not Catholic. Something like that. You receive comments from people that simply they're just unaware. They don't know the tradition, and they're unable to really comment on it. Okay. Now, this event was extremely important for the Eastern churches. Now, it didn't change, well, I shouldn't say that. No. Up until the Second Vatican Council, ever since Pope Leo XIII, Leo XIII had written an encyclical letter on the Eastern churches. And what Leo XIII, Benedict XV, Pius X, Benedict XV, Pius XI, Pius XII, and so on. All of those popes up until Vatican II had begun gradually tilling the soil to give the Eastern churches more of a presence and to enable the Western Catholics to be more familiar with the East, to kind of recover what was lost over time. Because what happened after this event was, remember I said that the Union was signed and the Eastern Catholics were guaranteed to keep their traditions. Well, do you think it happened very cleanly and very well? Not really. We ended up sending out seminarians to Jesuit schools and Roman Catholic seminaries, where our people were taught, your tradition is inferior to the Latin tradition. And therefore, the more you start looking like us as Latins, the more Catholic you will be. So, and that, after 500 years, really began to solidify. So that by the time we got to the Second Vatican Council, we actually had Eastern Catholics that thought that, yes, to be a Latin Catholic was superior and it was better, which is not what the church, there were some things in history which did suggest that the so-called Prestancia Regis Latini, right, the preeminence of the Latin rite. But the Eastern Catholics truly came to believe that. Now, Leo XIII, all his popes up to the Second Vatican Council, began tilling the soil to say, no, you guys, in fact, the famous quote, I believe it was Benedict XV, who said, the Church of Jesus Christ is neither Latin nor Greek nor Slav, it is Catholic. Okay, so all of them preparing the soil, tilling the soil to help the people to understand that the Church of Christ is not just this one mold, it's actually multiform. It actually is a variety of apostolic traditions. And each of those traditions have to be true to themselves, and if we commune together, the Church will flourish. And at the Second Vatican Council, as you may know, one of the 16 documents was devoted to the Eastern Catholic churches, and it's marvelous. It helped us incredibly. And this is what it said. This is an old picture of Pope Benedict XVI with various patriarchs of some of the Eastern churches. And what the Second Vatican Council taught, and again, this is very important. If you think about it, remember I said that there was a sense before Leo XIII that the Latin rite was the superior rite. The Second Vatican Council solemnly taught this. Okay? The one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church is actually a communion of churches, a communion of the Latin phrase is sui iuris, self-governing churches. So And it's important because, again, some people will respond to that and say, wait a minute, isn't the Catholic Church just one? And the answer is, yes, it is. One Holy Catholic Apostolic, it is one. But the churches, that word can also be used in a local sense. So, for example, I speak of the Church of Charleston and the Church of Savannah, the diocese. They are in communion with one another, and together they form the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. What's an Eastern Catholic? Up until the Second Vatican Council, an Eastern Catholic was considered someone, a Roman Catholic, who belonged to a different ritual tradition, who really was a little bit inferior to the Roman tradition. But the Second Vatican Council taught solemnly here that each Catholic Church sui juris is equal in dignity, and none of them is more important than the others. It's very, very important that happened, because an ecumenical council finally said that the notion that the Latin rite is the real rite and everything else is sort of a watered down, Diet Coke version, that's not the proper way of speaking about apostolic churches. They're all equal, and none are more important than the others. Now, another thing too, the Vatican Council taught that what's a church? A church is a group of the faithful united by a hierarchy. That comes right out of the fathers, especially Ignatius of Antioch. The notion of the Eucharistic Assembly, where the bishop, and really in Ignatius' terms of the bishops, sort of stands in the place of God the Father, gathering around himself all of his children, the presbyters in the place of the apostles, the deacons, by the way, in the place of Christ, for Ignatius, and so united by a hierarchy is all the faithful under them. So that's what defines a church. So if I look here at the phrase churches, a church has a hierarchy at the head, and a hierarchy of patriarch, major, archbishop, metropolitan, whatever it is. But that's what defines a church. Almost like you guys in Charleston are a church under your leadership, John. Right? I speak French. I hope I pronounced his name correctly. I think he still uses that name, so forgive me if I mispronounced his name. But he is your shepherd, your hierarch, forming the local church. Well, that was expanded here to describe these Eastern Christians, and then, in a universal sense, the Pope of Rome as the having a universal sort of jurisdiction. So you see how it works. It's like an onion thing, the local to the medium to the high. All right. What distinguishes an Eastern Church? Now, the Vatican Council talked about these four things. A lot of people think that an Eastern Catholic is basically a Roman Catholic who celebrates the fun Mass. Some people have attended my Mass before, especially, for example, that I celebrated Transfiguration Day once a month. And I've had people come in and they've actually said, like, I don't know what religion you are, Father, but you're definitely not Catholic. And I'm like, well, why do you say that? I think I would know what faith I am. And people have said, well, you celebrate a really weird Mass. I've never seen anything like this. How can you possibly be Catholic? So I said, well, we have our own liturgical tradition. But people do think that that's the only thing that distinguishes us. Whereas what distinguishes us as Eastern Christians are four different things. We have our own canon law, we have our own disciplines, we have our own feast days, our own fasting days, our own way of practicing the faith. We have our own spirituality, ancient prayers and devotions that stretch back almost all the way to the apostles, and also our own theological expression. What do I mean by that? I don't mean that we disagree with the Latin tradition. I mean that we have our theological inspiration often comes from the Greek fathers, whereas the Latin tradition, for example, takes a lot from Augustine, Ambrose, Thomas Aquinas, and so on. So we have our own distinctive marks here. Okay, I'm going to pause there and ask the good deacons if I should stop or if I should continue, I will leave it to the good deacons to tell me what to do next.
Let's take a.
I should say to keep time because I'm not sure how much longer I have.
Let's take a 3-minute break and return at 5.
John, I think you're saying something. That's not coming through. Okay, someone just sent me a message about the break. Thank you so much.
How was that experience for you? And you know, really look good themselves that you don't do ordination about you're trying to get a long time. sitting out. At this age, he's still
Okay, can you hear me on the computer now? Can you hear me over the computer? I can hear you over the phone, yes. Fine, okay, so I will begin. Okay. No worries. I will finish this presentation, this part, and then you can do questions. Okay, very good. Okay, everyone, welcome back from the break. I'm going to quickly share my screen here and make sure. Okay, so I'm quickly going to finish this presentation because I'd like to bring all of this discussion a little bit to more or less a contemporary sphere. In the conflict that's taking place now between Russia and Ukraine, one cannot forget the religious history that has been the case. Every time the Ukraine has experienced this from Russia, one of the first to suffer has always been the Catholic Church. This is nothing new in the history of Eastern Christians, particularly in Ukraine. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the 20th century, because this may or may not be familiar to you. But Up until the end of the Second World War, there was an enormously influential bishop, Andrzej Szeptycki, who was the Metropolitan of Lviv, a former Polish count that had rediscovered his Eastern Catholic roots and had decided to join an Eastern monastery, and eventually was made a bishop and Metropolitan Archbishop here. And one of the things he did was sort of to organize those people and to reintroduce them to their heritage. Now, as you know, with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, so between 1917 and 1914, well, that's a long time. You know that one of the things that the Soviet regime tried to do is to squash Christianity. And what had happened is Stalin realized that it wasn't a very simple thing to merely just get rid of Christianity. And so what he decided to do was to make use of a state-run church in order to control the situation up there. Of course, he was using the Russian Orthodox Church. Now this fellow, Metropolitan Andrei, dealt ecumenically with the Russian Church. But because he was such an enormous figure, the KGB, the Soviets, really couldn't do anything to squash him until he died, which he did in 1944. So towards the end of the Second World War, the Nazis drove him back, eventually ousted, the Red Army comes in and takes over again. Well, Metropolitan Szeptycki's successor, Josip Slypin, by the way, his last name means the blind. To my knowledge, he was not blind, so Joseph the Blind was his successor. Now, pardon me, I'm going to drink a little since my throat is getting a little tickly. What happened in 1946, so 2 years after the death of Metropolitan Andrei? What you see here is a series of very interesting pictures, and I'm going to explain them. Pardon me. In the top here, you see a picture of 3 clerics at the middle of the top. You see a picture here of 3 clerics. Now, what happened was, as I mentioned, the KGB realized that it was unable to oust the Eastern Catholic Church from Ukraine. And so it came up with a technique of trying to oust it from within. It made a deal with these 3 men. These 3 men agreed to repudiate the union with Rome. And as a reward, if you will, for doing that, the Russian authorities agreed to have them consecrated bishops. So in 1946, they orchestrated a pseudo-synod. Now you can see that on the top left-hand side of the screen, you see a picture of a bunch of priests raising their hands. Okay, so in 1946, in the Cathedral of St. George, which is the primatial see of the Greek Catholics in Lviv and Western Ukraine, these priests were gathered, probably the more weak-willed priests. Why? Because the stronger-willed were probably carted off to camps in Siberia and so on. All of the bishops had already been taken to Siberia. Joseph Slypin, the first among them. None of the bishops repudiated communion with Rome. These 3 were priests repudiated communion with Rome. 2 of them were consecrated bishops. Okay. Eventually, these priests raised their hands in affirmative response to the motion, do you wish to break communion with Rome and, quote, reunite with your mother church of Russia, which historically was not the case at all. I have here a YouTube link, I'm not going to play it up right now, but it's an interesting watch because it was filmed by the KGB. You can actually watch a video of all of this, and they documented it, as if to suggest something triumphalistic was happening. And what had happened was, as I mentioned, all the bishops went to the underground, and from that point onwards, there took place just a campaign of martyrdom against the Greek Catholic Church in not simply in Ukraine, but also in the Transcarpathian region, also in Romania, and not to mention Catholics in Russia and Belarus and so on. But symbolically, this was probably the most well known. I would like to introduce you to some of these folks. These, there were 20 odd, for some reason I can't remember exactly how many. There were 20 odd martyrs that were beatified by St. John Paul II when he visited Ukraine in 2001. I want to introduce you to some of these. Now, these men you see here were the bishops, and I'll perhaps mention some of the more interesting of those facts. The top left, top left here, you see Bishop Gregory Commission, who was beaten because he was asked by the interrogators, so you dare to speak out against communism, you dare to fight against the Soviet authority. And Bishop Gregory just kept saying, yes, I did, and I always will. And he was beaten with books, and he was beaten. Next to him on the right, a very interesting bishop, Nicholas Charnetsky, who, according to official data, underwent 600 hours of interrogation and torture, and spent time in 30 different prisons and camps. So he was exiled. He died eventually as a result of his sufferings. Next to him, you have Bishop Simeon Lukács, who I believe was an underground bishop. He wouldn't reveal the names of those people he had baptized and married. And so, pardon me, he just decided. The next one, I apologize. I think I'm running on adrenaline, which is fine. The Lord will preserve me. On the top right here, you have Bishop Theodore Romja, whose body I was able to venerate when I was in Slovakia. Bishop Theodore Romja they attempted to kill him by running a military vehicle into his horse carriage, and then eventually he was beaten and poisoned in the hospital for his Catholic faith. In the bottom left here, Bishop Gregory Lakota, again, was exiled and endured unbearable conditions. Next to him was Ivan Sleziuk. He's the only one there without clerical attire, right? Ivan Sleziuk there. The stories go that he was often called to the KGB for conversations, and after one of these conversations, he fell ill and never recovered. Next to him in the middle is Bishop Nikita Budka, and he was exiled. He was in Canada. A friend of mine, a priest friend of mine, has actually written a biography of his life. I don't know much about him, but he was exiled to Kazakhstan for his Catholic faith. Next to him, with the magnificently long beard, is Bishop Josephat Silovsky. And Bishop Josephat was put in jail and recognized as a holy man by people of different faiths, Orthodox and Catholic. Finally, there's Bishop Basil Velichkovsky. He actually died in exile in Canada, but again, they were so affected by the beatings and the interrogations that they went through that the stories go that these men are never the same. Now, these are just the bishops, but these are the priests, and the priests actually have a little bit more of a horrible story, especially some of them. On the top left, you see a painting of a priest with a beard, and that's Blessed Lady Theodorov. He was actually a Russian Greek Catholic, and he was appointed head of the Russian Greek Catholic Church. He unfortunately died at the hands of the Bolsheviks. Next to him, the priest with the headgear, that shows he's a monastic. In our tradition, monks wear the headgear as well as the nuns. Okay. So Father Zinovi was tortured and crucified against a wall in prison. for his faith. And he said, if that's God's will, I will gladly accept death, but as a redemptorist preacher, I will never act against my conscience. So he allowed himself to be crucified against the wall. Next to him is Father Andrew Estrak. And Father Andrew was shot in the stomach and stabbed in the neck. Next to him was Father Severian Baranek. Now the name Baranek, it actually means lamb. So it has a very, if you will, Eucharistic appropriateness to his name. He was arrested, and the story goes that that the sign of the cross had been slashed from his chest when he was killed. So again, bearing on his body the marks of the crucified Christ. The fellow to his right is my personal favorite, Blessed Emilian Koch. EWTN has actually aired a documentary of his. He was put in a camp, in a concentration camp by the Nazis, actually. So he was one of those killed by the German forces as opposed to the Russian forces. And he was in Maidan, concentration camp. And his family had secured a way for him to be released. And he wrote back to his family and said, don't release me. I am the only priest that these people have. And he spent his days baptizing Jews, baptizing people, consoling them on their way to die. So he actually told his family, do not release me, do not get me out. Finally, to the right here on the top, you have Father Alex Zaritsky, another who ended up in Kazakhstan. On the second row, Father Yakim Senkiewski, he died horribly. He was a monk, and he was boiled to death in a cauldron because of his Catholic faith. Next to him, he looks like a bishop, but he was an apostolic visitor, so he wore the regalia of that. He was exiled to Siberia. Next to him was Clement Szeptycki. Now, Clement Szeptycki was the brother of Andrew Szeptycki. Remember, these were Polish counts. They lived very comfortable lives. So, Clement Szeptycki, again, was exiled and died in prison in Russia. Next to him is Father Ivan Ziatek. And Father Ziatek was severely beaten, drenched with water, and left to freeze in the cold for his Catholic faith. In the final row, the bottom left, you have Father Nicholas Stahelski. And Father Nicholas died under horrid conditions in the camp and suffered from severe pain due to an illness and died there. Next to him was Father Vitaly Bayerak and died as a result of having been severely beaten in Drohovich, the famous prison in a place in Western Ukraine where I've been. Next to him, the rather dashingly handsome young priest, Father Roman Lisko. Father Roman, his family tried to get information and the communications were always intercepted. And he was sealed alive in a wall for his Catholic faith. And finally, these other two, with a little gap in the middle, they kind of go together because Father Nicholas Conrad and the gentleman with a tie to his right is Vladimir Grima, and Vladimir was the cantor of Father Nicholas. And Father Nicholas responded to the request for the final sacraments, and the cantor had gone with him. And because of that, they were killed. There were also women religious who gave their life for the faith. I'm not so familiar with their story, but there are some very interesting flavors there. So these folks are very, very important because they remind us of two things. Number one, this is not the first time that the churches in the East and Europe have suffered, and especially the Catholic faith. The resilience of people, and so it's happening again. These are recent pictures of churches that have been destroyed by invaders from Russia, but the resilience of those people remains. This is a picture from the Maidan. I always love this picture because I think it's a wonderful image of the spiritual warfare of a priest, what we are called to do, to be right there in the middle of the battlefield. But the resilience of those people is something that I think we can learn throughout the world. So what I'd like to do is I wanted to present that to you just to give you a little information on, just to kind of complete the story and to bring it to the modern world. Is this church something only for this part of the world? Not at all, not at all. Because as Christ said, make disciples of all nations. And these wonderful women and men have taught us what being a disciple means. It shows us the strength of Christ, even in the midst of the harsh reality of war throughout the world. Our patriarch, Sviatoslav, he is our young major archbishop of Kiev, who, by the way, the bishop of our right in Buenos Aires. At the same time, Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio was the bishop of Buenos Aires. And they were friends. And he said now, after all, the Eastern churches have gone through, they've spread throughout the world. They've gone far beyond the ethnic context. Today we are a church in which children of different nations and nationalities find themselves. This is beautiful, see that none of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And we're here to share our experience of God, and we can share that in English. So that was a question that was asked. Is this tradition only for those parts of the world, or is it something for everybody? And the church is very clear. It is something that can teach everybody, can welcome everybody. Okay, here ends the first part of the talk, so I'm going to turn it over to the deacon. If there are any questions before lunch.
Sorry, if anybody has any questions, you have
We have to take
Somebody have a question? Back, come over this way. This is also my internet connection.
There. Wow. The man, the man. Father, I was wondering, would you be willing to share with us the PowerPoint that you presented? Matt? Somebody did ask that question. If you wrote the law, said you was in. Great. Yes, sir.
Okay, I have, John, I have your phone up, and I'm wondering, oh, there you go.
Sorry, somebody had one question. I guess we asked earlier, but if you'd be able to share the handouts, that's the PowerPoint.
Yes, I will definitely share them. Someone had mentioned that this will be valuable to RCIA. Yes, absolutely. There are so many pastoral situations where it's so very important to understand this. So I would love to be able to give examples, especially to deacons, in order to show, why this is important sacramentally and things of that nature. So yes, I can share this.
Just one thing, could he also share references?
They asked me
The bibliography.
some of the references and some of the things that you said when it was on.
Yes, which references specifically?
Would you be talking about things like when he's talking about what happened in the priests?
Yes.
So like.
Oh, yes. Yes, I'd be happy to. There's a website that actually gives, one of our parishes in Canada actually gives a summary of their life story. So I'd be happy to share that with you.
John, could you ask him about the training and activities of their deacons versus what we are allowed to do with their deacons? That's what I'm talking about. Yeah. Okay, great. Is a, John. Yes, one second. Okay, yeah, is a Greco-Catholic cardinal eligible to become pope? Is it correct? Is it Greco-Catholic cardinal eligible to be pope?
Yes, in fact, historically, there have been Eastern popes in the early church. It's just that the Italians had a monopoly on the papacy.
Other questions?
Occasionally, we run into other rights and Orthodox prison ministry. What's a desired approach for us to help them find the best contact they can for their expression?
Okay, so the questions deal with prison ministry. Occasionally, when we're in the prisons, that we find people that are outside of from Latin Catholic Church. What's the best way to try to find a link for them to find help in the state of South Carolina?
Yeah, this is a very good question because, as I mentioned, our presence is very slim. I'm really the first priest that was asked to come down and start something, so it was really a David to Goliath situation for me. I think in the case, like in South Carolina, I think a good cooperation with the Roman Catholic diocese, where we have a few faithful scattered around, but we don't have many of the resources. So I think what I would do is to, if I were there, have a good relationship with the diocese. So perhaps contact the local Eastern parish or the closest one, find out what tradition that person comes from. So you never know, and this is a good point. So if you have RCIA, for example, someone comes in and says, I belong to, I don't know, the Greek Orthodox Church. Well, that person is, even upon being received into the Catholic Church, that person does not become a Latin Catholic, regardless of where that reception is taking place. Canonically speaking, an Eastern Orthodox Christian is received into the church within the corresponding Eastern Catholic Church, even if they do so at a Latin Rite parish. So that's the principle of East to East. So to be in touch with the local Eastern Catholic parish, be in touch with their diocese, maybe trying to find out where that person's heritage is, looking up the closest Catholic diocese that corresponds with that, having the local or the nearest pastor know that so-and-so is here, could be ministered to, and then if the local priest happens to be far away, then we would work in consult with the Roman Rite priest or deacon or whoever, in order to help the person. That's been my experience of what to do when we're all spread very, very thinly.
So, if that came up, would it be something I could just connect with you about?
Yes, I would be very happy to help. Yes.
I have, my phone is the internet connection, to talk to you, and somebody texted me that's online, that says, I'd be asked, Father, what is the variety amongst Byzantine rites? Is it significant? Is it minor, such as the Roman rite of Catholics would that Catholics would even notice?
I think an untrained eye might not really care to notice. I think the most obvious difference will probably be in the musical tradition, a pact in the language. So some of our congregations are more immigrant eyes than others, and so their liturgy would be in the language of that population. Other communities like mine, we pray in English, or American, as they might say. And so the musical traditions would be different. It would be almost difficult to tell, really, unless you're very familiar.
And the same person sent another question. And it's just reiterating that, but a better question is to ask what the theological points that the Roman Catholics can get from looking at Eastern Catholicism.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And in order not to keep everyone for hours and hours, I would say the sort of a rediscovery of the patristic and monastic desert fathers spirituality, where there's sort of a rediscovery of that since the 20th century, but we take a lot of our inspiration from, the fathers, the mystics, John Climacus, the Desert Fathers, the Cappadocian Fathers. It's almost like monasticism, but just applied spirituality thereof, the ethos thereof, applied to lay people, married people, clerics in their own states of mind. So not just an intellectual exercise. So the West is often characterized as being a lot more intellectual. Let's state every single problem and say exactly what it is. The East is sometimes described as being more mystical, although that's a little bit of a generalization. But I think that more of a mystical approach, more of a sense of eschatology, so sort of eschatological approach. So when we go to the Divine Liturgy, for example, we're stepping into heaven. We're understanding the mystery lived as taught to us by the saints, the Holy Fathers and Mothers, and what they've handed down to us is the way to navigate through the forest of life. That's just a few words that stick out in my mind.
Father, can you hear me? It's Deacon Andrew Stoshak. I have a question for you. I was ordained in St. Peter's Cathedral in Pennsylvania.
I should mention, if I may, canonically it's, I don't know if the diocese has something like this, training in sort of canonical norms for deacons, but we're working on something up here because what happens is there are some very, very important canonical things that have to be taken into account. So I mentioned one example. So when an Eastern Orthodox Christian comes into communion with the Catholic Church, that those persons join the corresponding Eastern Church. With marriage, it's another big one. So with marriage, the blessing of a priest is required. So if there is even one Eastern Catholic, or perhaps two, at least one, the blessing of the priest is required. So the blessing of the deacon alone actually, by the canons, invalidates the marriage. So it's important to make sure that those records, and it's difficult because what happens is our faithful, they move down south over the last 30, 40 years, and nobody really cared about these things, or records were lost and everything. So eventually these things get discovered 12 hours before the wedding, and clerics pull their hairs out and try to figure out, what do we have to do to regularize this marriage to make sure. So I hope that we can develop something to help priests and deacons of the Latin tradition be able to sort of understand, what to do in each case. So if someone comes with this sacrament, someone comes with that sacrament, I think it would be a good resource for all of them.
Father Diaconate Stoshak, I was ordained in St.
There's
Peter's.
a hand raised, an iPhone.
Yes, I have a question, Father, can you hear me?
Father, I don't think he can hear you. I'm gonna let him speak, and then I'll repeat the question.
Oh, sure.
Father, if you would just tell.
Can you hear me now?
Tell whoever's talking that we can hear it, and I'll repeat the question. He can't hear me.
Okay, so someone is asking a question, and
Yes, the
the
question,
deacons there can hear you, but it seems you cannot hear them.
the question I
So if
have,
you could repeat the question, and the deacons will repeat the question to me again.
okay, the question I have is, I was ordained a deacon in 1993, St. Peter's Cathedral, Pennsylvania. I was told that my grandfather immigrated from Ukraine early in life, and I wondered the story of the confession that I was told, is that true?
Did you hear that? Or did you repeat it?
I did not hear it.
Okay, so, yeah.
So, Father, one of the deacons, his grandfather, came from the Eastern tradition. He wanted to know the succession. So, because it was patriarchal, I would imagine he is eligible to provide the like
Yes, so it is patriarchal. In fact, the Holy Father, not too long ago, published a document clarifying it. So it goes through the patriarchal line. So you are what your father is, he is what his father is, and so on and so on. Nowadays, there is a new provision whereby the couple can agree to raise the children in the mother's tradition. So anyone born after the year 1990, because that's when the new code came out for the East, which allowed for this, but anyone before then, it was the patriarchal tradition usually. So I would encourage anyone, if the patriarchal line is Oriental, and I use that phrase Oriental, it's the canonical term to refer to all the Eastern churches, whatever tradition you happen to be, then I would encourage you to investigate that because it might need to regularize things. Now, obviously, it probably no one's fault. It's just, again, the way things go with people moving and marrying all kinds of people from all over the place. But I would encourage you to regularize that. Now, interestingly, if this interests any of you, a deacon does not need bi-ritual faculties to deacon an Eastern Rite liturgy. Only a priest does. So I have bi-ritual faculties. I celebrate also in the Latin Rite. I had to get that permission from Rome. A deacon only needs the permission of the two bishops. So if any of you, for example, happen to be, I don't know, in Lightwood when I celebrate, and you say, hey, I'd love to deacon, you would be allowed to do that, presuming the bishop's permission. So that's an interesting factoid, if anyone, and it's actually a beautiful experience. And when I got my bi-ritual faculties, I learned this. There is nothing like learning to love the Eucharist again than to learn how to do it in a new rite, R-I-T. For me, there was nothing like it because I had to learn it all over again. And it was like going back to the beginning. And it really helped me love the sacraments, love the Eucharist. So, just an interesting little fact with it. But yes, I would definitely say to go back and look that up, because you may very well be an Eastern Catholic and your children as a result.
Any other questions?
Father had any relatives in Ukraine or so.
The question was asked if you have any relatives in Ukraine, and if so, how are they doing?
Thank you very much. I do have relatives in Ukraine. One of them missed a rocket by 200 meters. She survived. Others are in the east, and they were evacuated. Most of them are still in the west, so they're relatively safe. But they have the fear of not knowing, whether they're going to survive tomorrow or not. My language isn't very strong, so I'm unable to communicate with them beyond simple Ukrainian. But I do my best to at least stay in touch. But so far they are alive. Thankfully.
So we're gonna break into lunch and we will get back in touch with you. But it won't go all that 5 minutes to 1. And everybody will be sitting there at 1 o'clock, ready to go. That's right.
Wonderful.